Okay, good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going to talk about the future of the internet as we know it. And before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Mike Goat. Hope everyone had a chance to check out the website, download the app. And I would like to introduce you to my friend Justin, who is the CEO of Mike Goat, and he's going to tell us more about this app.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me tonight. I'm one of the co-founders of Mike Goat. Where essentially it's a iPhone app to do what you guys are doing in person, but digitally. So the problem in society right now is, people tend to hang out with their friends. They get influenced by their friends' opinions, which tend to be similar to them. Social media, if you go to Facebook for news, they show you news that you tend to click on. And that's why, when Trump gets elected, for instance, half the country is shocked that, half the country was that unhappy with the previous administration. So we built a technology app where anyone can basically debate somebody else on important topics in society. So far, we've hosted hundreds of debates. We've just launched the app last week, but we have, experts as well as regular people just debating things like net neutrality, immigration policies, Bitcoin, stocks, sports. So we hope you guys download the app tonight and try it out. And we're going to use the app as part of some of the debates here as well, just to showcase the technology. But thanks again for having me.
And before we get started, hope everyone had a chance to go to that URL that's on the whiteboard. What we're trying to do is, this is an Oxford debate, so we take a poll before and after the debate, and the party that will win this debate will be the one that sways the people's opinions on this topic. If you have not had a chance to go to that website, let me know, because we do have paper ballots. So with that being said, I also want to give a shout out to my friends who are here tonight. Mike Walsh, running the camera, a good friend of mine for a long time. And also my friend Ali will be the timekeeper. So for the debaters, you want to keep an eye on that watch right there, clock right there. So tonight's debate is about net neutrality. So what are we debating about is the future of the internet. And the debaters will certainly fill you in on the merits of this policy. Why we're having this debate right now is because the FCC recently passed a ruling that pretty much undoes the previous administration's position on net neutrality. And the debaters will talk about the merits of this new ruling. As some of you know, I also run a political organization called NYC Political Forum, and what we do for that group is we look at these issues from a political and historical context. So from that context, I think the concept of internet is a very American phenomena. And what I mean by that is internet, it certainly has a far-reaching impact all across the globe in different corners of the world. It also has borderless, stateless type of existence. However, if you look at the history of America, for instance, it's founded on this kind of principle of frontier and being exploratory. And I believe internet is kind of like that too, because you could be whoever you want to be, whatever you want to be. And this thing that we're calling the internet exists because that's the beauty of it. People could exist in any shape or form, join any group, go to whatever website, promote yourself, start a business. So in order to keep that as is, what is the best way forward for the internet? And that's what we're debating tonight. And this brings us to the topic of tonight's debate, which is governments should implement net neutrality. And the definition is the principle that internet service providers, ISPs, must treat all data on the internet the same and not discriminate or charge differently by user, content, website, platform, application, type of attached equipment, or method of communication. That's the working definition of net neutrality. So without any further ado, we are going to introduce you to our debaters. So one side is going to be the proponents of net neutrality, meaning in order to preserve the level playing field, there should be government intervention. And the other side is going to argue against that. So team 1, which is to my right, we have Fred. And Fred is an author and a filmmaker. Most recently, he produced a Netflix original feature documentary entitled Get Me Roger Stone, which premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. He is also a director and producer of a documentary entitled Uprising, a feature documentary about Arab Spring in Egypt. And he authored a book entitled Great Negotiations, Agreement That Changed the Modern World. Welcome, Fred. Okay, in team 2, we have Louis. Louis is 26-year-old IT tech, born and raised in Brooklyn. He has a degree in computer science and has a deep passion for all things technology and political. As a problem solver, when Louis isn't solving other technical problems for friends or coworkers, he's an avid researcher and devourer of ideas across the political spectrum. He's also a frequent attendee of numerous discussion groups and debate series, including this very own group. Hello, Louis. Welcome. Okay, next we have, back to team 1, Garrett. Garrett was a developer in the 1990s and transitioned into product management by 2001. He's been inventing innovative software ever since, including in financial services, ad technology, and marketing tech. He has managed budgets up to $30 million and development teams around the world, including Russia, India, Israel, Europe, China, Mexico, and here in the US. Recently, Garrett created his own company to help people find great food, and the website is called platerate.guru. So platerate, one word, .guru, G-U-R-U. And we'll put the links up on the board later. He hosts and attends meetups on philosophy, programming, product management, and most importantly, wine tasting. Garrett, and Garrett has a computer science degree from Cornell. Welcome, Garrett.
Thank you.
And last but not least, back to team 2, is Rob. Rob is a computer programmer, also a Cornell graduate with a master's in operations, research, and information engineering. He originally is from Haverhill, Massachusetts, but has lived in the city for the past 7 years. Rob has been very active in political discussions and debate for most of his adult life. He has a strong interest in economics, history, and philosophy. Rob maintains a blog at the following website. It's called capitalismandideas.com. And he also co-runs a meetup group called New York Intellectual Discussion Group. Welcome, Rob. All right, so before we move to the opening statements, let me just tell you about the format for tonight, which is you'll hear 5-minute introductory statements from each side, and then we'll do what's called a crossfire. And during the crossfire, we're going to actually use this app to capture some of the live moments. And then after that, we're going to open it up to the audience. We'll have the Q&A. If you want to ask a question to either group, we ask that you come up here to the podium and direct your question. Then we'll do the closing arguments, and then we'll do another round of voting, a different website, different link. And then that will conclude the debate. So without any further ado, we'll start with team 1 with the opening statement on net neutrality.
Universal sign for a timeout. You know, the cut for the time.
Yeah, I mean, they know how to watch the clock, so sure. Okay, very good.
All right. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you all for taking the time to come listen to our debate. I'd like to thank NYC Debate for organizing the event, and thank Mike Goat for sponsoring it. As the affirmative, we stand in favor of the resolution. Resolved, the government should implement net neutrality. We all know the internet as something both magical and robust, invulnerable, and on an inevitable trajectory of ever-increasing benefits to mankind. However, the principles that have defined the greatest technological development of our time, openness, fairness, and opportunity, are under threat and could disappear if we do not take steps to protect them. Since the Internet's earliest days in the late 1970s, as a tool developed by the US government for military communication and then for scientific collaboration, openness has been at the heart of its success. Its growth was fueled by the ability of providers to add nodes that strengthened the network, and for creators and innovators to add content and functionality that improved people's lives and increased demand. This symbiotic relationship proved advantageous for both parties and made the Internet an indispensable part of our lives. There are three key pillars of why net neutrality should be implemented: freedom, fairness, and it's in keeping with the status quo and will protect the Internet as we know it. Freedom. The Internet is about freedom. From its inception, its greatest strength, the defining quality that sets it apart from the tangle of wires and hardware and software that make up the sum of its parts, is freedom. Nowhere in the world can people create, collaborate, play, and learn with such unfettered liberty. It is one of the bedrock principles of our nation, and one that the Internet spreads to people around the world who would not otherwise have it. Freedom of speech, freedom of exchange of ideas, and freedom from interference are not to be traded for commercial advantage. Just as a phone company provides the capacity but cannot intrude or interfere in anyone's conversations, Internet providers should not be allowed to discriminate by user or by type of content. Freedom, with technology, as with other areas, works on a moral level and also a practical one. Anyone remember BlackBerries, AOL, Prodigy? History is littered with examples of closed architecture technologies that failed because creating a closed community stifled innovation and choked off growth. Open systems, like the Internet at present, are able to harness the contributions of new inventions and applications to add value and grow demand. Fairness. The twin sister of freedom is fairness. The Internet is an open space that allows room for the largest of global companies, as well as the artisanal craftsmen, the mom-and-pop shops, and the hobbyists. It does not discriminate between email and video, cat videos, and videos that launch revolutions and topple regimes. The Internet is the great leveler. Language barriers, age differences, physical handicaps don't matter as much on the Internet. The notion that entrepreneurs can compete on a level playing field and that the companies that control the pipes can't tip the scales in favor of their corporate friends or preferred political views or country of origin or content type is vital to the future of the Internet. Point 3, it's the status quo. The good news is that net neutrality is not a departure from the Internet status quo. It's the Internet as we know it, and it's been commercially successful for the companies that keep it running. The US government has always had a role in the Internet. It started it, after all, and has always played a role in how it runs. Protocols and guardrails are necessary to any smoothly functioning system, and the Internet is no exception. Net neutrality is simply a natural extension of historical regulation to preserve what we've built for the future. The Internet is the greatest development in human affairs in our lifetime. It is our generation's most profound contribution to the advancement of mankind. And yet, despite the fact that it is in every corner of the earth and affects every facet of our lives, it is fragile. The Internet that we enjoy as a free, open system can easily descend from a global commons into a balkanized wilderness. We have it in our power to prevent that and to preserve the Internet for ourselves and future generations. Our society has long recognized that there are areas in which clear, simple rules are necessary, not to curb freedom, but to preserve it. Implementing net neutrality guidelines, preserving the system already in place, with the universal principle that all must be treated equally and fairly as a simple and obvious necessity. We must enact it today before it is too late.
Okay, thank you, Fred. And now we'll move to Team 2, arguing in opposition of tonight's topic, again, which is government should implement net neutrality. I'll pass it over to Rob.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. So I want to begin very much like my opponent began with framing this discussion in a very important light, and that's an ethical light. We must frame this discussion in terms of morals and ethics, and particularly in terms of three key concepts that I want to synopsize for you before I apply those concepts to the concept of net neutrality. Those concepts are the nature of man, the nature of government, and the nature of individual rights. Let's begin with the nature of man briefly. In Aristotle's words, man is the rational animal. His body may feel hunger, but only the use of his mind will tell him whether what he's about to put in his mouth is food or poison. A man's body may be racked by infection, but only his mind can teach him how to make medicines to treat the infection. What stops the use of the physical mind? Well, that's physical force. Physical force, is also known as coercion, is anti-mind and anti-reason. You can't think if someone brandishes a gun in your direction or threatens to break your legs should you come to the wrong conclusion. So that's point one. Man's basic means of survival is his mind, his reason. Point two, the nature of government. What is a government? Government is that institution with monopoly on force in a given area. Government's mandates are not optional. Try sometime ignoring a call from the IRS or disobeying a traffic cop on a routine stop. The essence of government is force. It's the only institution in society which can exercise its will using force. So that's point two. Government is force. That brings us to the third topic, which is, what is the relationship of government and its use of force to man? And here we get to the crucial notion of individual rights. Rights are principles that define one's freedom to act in a given social context. Rights do not entitle a person access to products or services that are created by others on the grounds of need or whim. Rights secure what a person creates by his own effort and allows him to trade with others freely. There is no right to a fair wage, only the right to negotiate terms with a willing employer. There is no right to a competitive price, only a right to discuss what one should pay for a given service or product. There is no right to happiness, only the right to pursue your happiness with the means available to you. Proper government recognizes this about individuals and works to protect their rights by the use of its physical force. So that's the third point. Proper, moral government protects individuals who are not violent from those who initiate force. It does not initiate force against its citizens, because when it does, it becomes no better than the two-bit thugs it should be protecting them from. So how does this apply to net neutrality? The question you have to ask yourself whenever you discuss a government policy is this question. Is this a proper place to use a gun instead of a comment card, a boycott, or even a rational argument? Equivalently, you can ask, are there any rights violations involved? Net neutrality is based on the idea that cheap internet access is a right. It treats the internet's expensive, glorious infrastructure, with which I wholeheartedly agree with, from my opponents, as a given, a nature-made given that did not come about by the use of man's reason. It is therefore an invalidation of property rights. It's an invalidation of the property rights of those who make it possible. That's the dreaded ISPs, internet service providers. Net neutrality omits the key question, a right at whose expense? Now, there are two fundamental misconceptions about net neutrality that I want to burst right now. The first is that net neutrality works to protect people from evil, greedy corporations. But the fact is that it's hard to get internet to your home. It's based on a myriad of cables, satellites, servers, and wireless connectors. Dial up to DSL to fiber optics and beyond. That's what the internet is today, and it was made possible by investment by ISPs who did it voluntarily. The top three internet providers alone spent over $100 billion from 2011 to 2013 to get us better service. And from 2005 to 2015, average broadband increased by 1,150%. So much for the mustache-twirling industrialist. What about free speech? The fact is that others are not obligated to provide you with a forum for your ideas. You can rent a hall, but you're not entitled to a mic at someone else's expense. You can publish in a newspaper that hires you. But if you can't get someone to publish your ideas, your supposed right to free speech doesn't compel them to make you do it. Content providers like Facebook and Twitter have always had terms of service that tell us what we can and can't do with their service. Why not do this with ISPs who make this product delivery possible in the first place? I'm going to end with this statement. The internet is an important part of life in today's world. I don't deny this. In fact, I use it on a daily basis. In fact, though, it is precisely because it is so vital that the least we can do for those who make it possible, rather than try to regulate them out of existence, is to say, if only once and as a whisper, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, back to team one in support of the topic. Garrett.
Great, thanks very much. So what I'm going to talk to you about, you can all hear me? I have a pretty loud voice. Usually people say I'm too loud. So essentially, we talked about the definition of net neutrality. It's about ISPs being able to regulate exactly what goes over the wires. So if you think about that, that essentially means that private companies who are providing a utility-like service, right? ISPs aren't that different from a telephone, for example. They're a ubiquitous part of life today. It'd be really hard to live life without the internet. We all know that. And essentially what it's saying is that ISPs can block any traffic for any reason and charge more money for certain traffic if they want to. So if we think about that, really what that's doing is restricting the right to free speech on the internet, because the ISPs are our doorway to the internet. So essentially, I agree with my opponents here that man has to have reason. I agree that man should have freedom, and I agree that government should not encroach on that freedom. And actually, I would argue he's sort of arguing against himself, because the freedom that we want is to be able to say what we want on the internet without ISPs censoring us. And the truth is, what reversing net neutrality does is it allows ISPs to censor whatever they want. If we think of a doomsday scenario, and I know this is going to sound outrageous, but it's actually legal. And if we think about some of the things that private enterprise has done in history that have been outrageous, but were not illegal at the time and they did them anyway, we can count slavery among those things. We can count child labor that today we would consider outrageous, but they were legal and companies did them to make money. The thing that could be outrageous now is that ISPs could get a big tax break from one particular political party, I'm not going to name which one, but then they could actually censor the other political party's traffic on the internet. This sounds outrageous, but actually it's being legalized. It's actually just been legalized. And that's censoring free speech. It's allowing ISPs to censor free speech. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. We all know that. We live in a pretty free country, but it could happen over time. And if we allow that to be legal, it will happen in small bits and pieces. And before you know it, the rights that we take for granted today will fall away. So second of all, internet day-to-day functioning is like a utility. If you think about it, it's very similar to a telephone. It's a way of communicating with people all around the world. That's what telephones do for us. We've kind of come to take for granted that no one's eavesdropping on our telephone calls. And if I'm on my Verizon phone and say, hey, I'm thinking of switching to AT&T, my phone has never shut off. But what this is saying is that if I say to one of my friends, I'm going to switch from Verizon as my landline, they can actually shut off my internet access. That's what it's saying. So literally, it's allowing, and if you look at, there's a government site that I'm happy to share with anyone afterwards that talks about net neutrality, and it includes deep packet inspection, which if you look at it, is looking at the content of internet packets and saying that ISPs are allowed to filter and basically discern between the content of what you're sending over the internet. Now, the limits are not defined in the reversal of net neutrality. ISPs are allowed to discern however they want to in their own judgment without any legal repercussions whatsoever. So again, I'm talking about the doomsday scenario to prove a point, but it's going to be smaller things. And do we want to sell out free speech in favor of the profits of ISPs? Now, I'm all for ISPs making money. One thing that's a common misnomer about net neutrality is that people think that net neutrality is about allowing people to pay for more bandwidth. We all know before net neutrality was reversed, if we get more bandwidth from our ISP, we pay more money. That's always been true for corporations too. I've bought corporate internet service, and when I got more bandwidth, it cost more money. Net neutrality is not about charging people for more bandwidth, more money. the ISPs can always regain their investments, the money on their investments. They've been very profitable. They would continue to be very profitable if we maintain a free and open internet. And so what I'm proposing is that we maintain a free and open internet. We ask ISPs to stay out of our personal free speech on what we say over the internet, and we allow them to run their business and provide the service that they've been providing. Now, another thing that our opponents might say is that if an ISP is violating free speech, there's free markets, right? And you could just go to another ISP that's not violating free speech. Well, there's two problems with that. One is all the ISPs could be violating free speech. But second of all, if you want a reasonable amount of bandwidth, 50% of people only have one possible internet service provider over 25 megabits per second, which if you like to use the internet for streaming video, you're going to want about 25 megabits a second at a minimum. So if you're one of those people, 50% of the country has no one else to go to. So even if your ISP is completely abusing these huge, broad, sweeping rights to censor anything they want on the internet, you can't switch to another ISP because you have no other choice. So that's all I've got.
Thanks, Garrett. And we will close out. And we'll close out the opening statements with Team 2. Thanks. In opposition of the topic. And that will be Louis.
There we go. Thank you very much. All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. I initially planned to open with a joke about being paid by big cable, but the jokes were so terrible that they actually paid me not to tell them. So, all right, as Rob has established, the internet is a product of the human mind, and it doesn't exist as a given. Let's elaborate just a bit more. What exactly does it take to get that internet service to your home? Well, that takes the commitment of an entrepreneur, someone who's willing to invest their own money into providing their customers with access to the internet. ISPs hire thousands of individuals to build out and maintain their networks. They purchase the miles of copper and fiber optic wiring that make the internet possible. They build and maintain the computers, Ethernet cables, monitors, servers, and software behind the scenes. What many people don't recognize is that all of that is actually the easy part of providing internet service. Before any construction can begin, ISPs have to jump through all sorts of regulatory hoops. First, they must negotiate with local governments to gain access to public rights-of-ways that run above and below private and public property. There are also contracts for pole attachments they must secure. These agreements can often double the cost of building out a network. And this isn't the worst of it. Local governments force concessions that drastically raise the cost of doing business. These include building out connectivity to areas where there's no demand and providing free broadband access to government buildings. In some cases, ISPs have been compelled to donate equipment. According to a 2011 FCC report, Verizon was forced to pay $33,000 annually for occupying only 19 feet of public right-of-way in New York. That's a length shorter than your average driveway. After they constructed 8 ducts for the purposes of running cable, they had to donate 2 of those ducts to the state authority. In Kentucky, the authorities there asked for 3% of Verizon's annual revenues and for an additional $1 million just to sign the contract. Verizon obliged. I guess you can't haggle with the state. As Rob mentioned earlier, man survives by the free exercise of his reasoning mind. No one has the right to the fruit of another person's reasoning. To take the opposing position would be to do away with the idea of individualism, because anything your mind can conjure and make tangible can be taken away from you by the collective if the collective deems it as being in their interest. This is exactly what net neutrality does. It denies private property owners their rights, thus stifling innovation. After all, where is the incentive to create when what you create can be taken away from you? Some may argue that the abuses carried out by ISPs in the absence of net neutrality justify the limits placed on private property. However, the alleged abuses solved by net neutrality have never occurred, and never occurred even when net neutrality wasn't in effect. Every instance of the supposed throttling was done to protect one group of customers from the usage pattern of others. As when Comcast blocked BitTorrent usage, there was no malice there. To cite another example, TELUS, a Canadian ISP, blocked access to a website supporting a labor strike against the company. But what is often left out of this narrative is that striking TELUS employees were using the website to encourage threats against the called scabs. It was within TELUS's rights to prevent its infrastructure from being used to harm its employees. Internet bills did not skyrocket and bankrupt the middle class. So-called fast lanes have not been created to put small web companies out of business. In other words, net neutrality supporters have consistently been proven wrong. That hasn't stopped them, though. Despite their consistent incorrect presumptions, they continue to try to take something important away from all of us: choice. The facts on the ground simply do not support the need for net neutrality. It is a government policy that has a lot to take, but nothing to offer. I'm not here arguing for a big sop to big cable companies. I'm here arguing for choice. Choice for the consumer in the way of innovative services and pricing. Choice for the entrepreneur in how to manage their property. Choice is the lifeblood of a strong economy. There is no factual basis for this regulation, and because ISPs know what their customers want, and that is choice. I see my time.
Okay, thanks, Louis. So that will finish up the opening statements, and now we'll move on to the next segment, which is the crossfire. And we'll get the apps queued up for this segment. And before we move on, I just want to remind folks, you're going to hear a wealth of information from both sides. These are terrific debaters. They've done a lot of research. But you want to keep in mind tonight's debate topic, which is government should implement net neutrality. So I believe it's fair to say that both sides believe in fair and open internet. It's just a matter of, do we want government involved? That's the operative term. And the best part about the next segment is that you get to witness the debates, debaters think on their feet and improvise and provide their reasoning based on the questions that are asked at them. So with that being said, we will let Team 2 start off the question to Team 1, and if you guys want to queue up the app, we'll get it going. So who from Team 2 will be asking the question? You guys have to come up to the podium. Rob? Louis?
You can go first.
Yeah, you have to come up here, and then we'll queue up the app.
Oh, I don't have it. I don't have an
Okay,
iPhone. So.
it's fine. You can use my phone.
Okay. So what should I do? Just ask a question here?
So it's a 1 minute opening statement, 30-second rebuttal, 30-second rebuttal.
Oh, so it's not a question? It's just a...
You could ask in a rhetorical sense. And
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That works for me. Okay.
Would you be pro or con for that?
We're con. Con, yeah.
So when you're ready, just...
All right. So I'll be looking at this, but I'll be talking to you guys. Remember. Sure. Yeah. You guys can hear me, so. Okay.
So when you're ready, just let me know.
I'm ready. So my opponent brings up the alleged abuses and lack of competition in the telecommunications industry. And as a rhetorical question, I would ask, who's to blame for this? Who's to blame for the lack of competition in the industry of telecommunications? The answer is actually government. As my partner had eloquently explained, there are many municipal and local regulations that can sometimes double the cost of installing and networks. And aside from that, you have many cases where smaller ISPs are either priced out of the market or unable to enter, or even they entirely abandon expanding to areas because there's no demand for them, since essentially the government has passed legislation making it nearly impossible for them to secure rights of way. So if you're concerned, which is my concern as well, that there's no competition, you should look no further than the government. And if you really want competition, you should advocate for free market capitalism, which actually creates competition.
Okay. Team 1, 30 seconds, right?
So I don't know.
It's posting, so it's 10 seconds.
Okay.
It's posting to the.
Do you want me to wait or can we go?
10 seconds.
10 seconds post. I got it. So you're going to reply. Okay, reply. So just hit recording again.
Okay. So I think, I was not actually arguing that the lack of competition is the big problem. What I was arguing is that not giving internet users free speech is the problem. And what I was saying is that if you can't go to another ISP, you can't get away from that lack of free speech. You are forced into the lack of free speech. So I don't see the lack of ISP competition being a huge problem. I don't pay that much for my internet. And quite frankly, I don't know anyone that says that their internet service provider is charging them completely unfair amounts. And I don't know any ISPs that have gone bankrupt anytime recently. So the ISPs seem to be making a lot of money under net neutrality. The customers seem to be pretty happy. So I don't see competition being the biggest problem. What I see as the biggest problem is us losing free speech opportunities with internet use, where ISPs can suddenly block our content on the internet and not give us free speech.
Okay, thanks.
Will we be able to respond, or?
Yeah.
I still have a very quick issue.
Well, we're gonna take turns a little.
Oh,
say that, but yeah, if you guys want to respond to that, is it 1 minute or 30 seconds?
No.
So this is 30 seconds rebuttal.
Yes, 30 seconds.
It's a different format for us.
You have 30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. Good. So I addressed the issue of free speech in my opening because I knew it would surface, and I want to reiterate the point because I want to make it very clear. All rights, including free speech, are contextual. They're framed by private property rights and the rights of others. You don't have free speech to come into my bedroom at 2 a.m. and sing the 12 Days of Christmas. You don't have the right to go to my newspaper and say, I demand an opinion piece in your newspaper. The websites are provided by content providers, and the ISPs provide the means to reach them.
Yeah, and then do we ask a question?
We're gonna ask a question in a rhetorical form for 1 minute.
Okay, so,
So you have 30 seconds to respond.
okay.
I can hold it.
I see. So first, I think one of the things that's surfaced in terms of the lack of competitive internet coverage is that we may be dealing with a natural monopoly, in which case there's an obvious argument for regulation. But I'd like to ask if you believe that internet providers are, as they have been, lawfully subject to FCC, Interstate Commerce Clause, and other government regulations.
Can you,
If they're lawfully subject to the FCC, Interstate Commerce Clause, and other government regulations.
I want you to do it. I feel like I have so much.
Oh, okay. Why don't you do it? I'll address it.
30 seconds?
Okay.
Just let me know when you're ready.
All right, I'm ready. Yeah. All right. So Garrett made a point about his point not being about competition, but if you raised the point about free speech issues, if competition was sufficient, like there would be no basis for this legislation. To I suppose talk about what the point that Frederick raised here. I suppose like it's my point that the FCC shouldn't exist. Like I'd make that argument. Like there's no reasonable basis for it to exist in the first place.
There's one more. There's one more.
So the question is, should the FCC exist? What's the functionality? That was the question.
Yeah, I think it should.
Okay. someone from Team 1 go up there and explain justify why the FCC exists?
I can ask another question.
Team 1? No?
Just, yeah, I'll field it. I mean, yeah, I mean, okay, sorry. Telephones and telecommunications have been around for, 100 years, and they're well-established practices that a certain amount of regulation is necessary for the efficient functioning of a national and international system. And FCC has served that fine for decades and decades, and will continue to do so to all of our benefit.
Can I respond to that? I got a million. We do this all day. Are we?
This is
Off the thing.
So it's gonna have to be off.
Oh, okay. Do you want to time my response, or should I just go? Okay. About the FCC existing, I don't think the FCC should exist. I think, in fact, the Interstate Commerce Commission shouldn't exist. I think they all represent overreaches of government authority in various ways. There's a difference between a law and a regulation. I mean, a law is an objective thing that the government says, we need this to prevent you from having rights violations occur. We have laws against murder, we have laws against rape and theft. The goal there is to protect individual rights. Regulations are a means to lead people to get things, free goodies that they wouldn't otherwise get without the law. So, for example, Interstate Commerce Commission was established to regulate the railroads, rein those in because people were upset with what they were doing. Even though what they were doing was basically growing the economy and making the Industrial Revolution possible in that time. The FCC, as far as I'm concerned, spends all its time looking through and trying to censor things shouldn't be heard by people in the culture. I think fundamentally, we have a separation of church and state in this country because we don't want the government to support ideas that people hold anathema, particularly religious views. I think that applies to all ideas. I think government shouldn't be in the business of ideas. Ideas are things that we are, as adults, can discuss in the culture. We don't need some bureaucrat, some busybody who's paid by our tax dollars to go around and tell us what we can and can't say or whether something is offensive. Can you imagine Thomas Jefferson being told when he wrote the Declaration of Independence that he had to censor what he was writing because it might be offensive to King George? It's unbelievable to think that you would need an FCC any more than you would need any other bloated government bureaucracy. That's all I have to say about that.
Back to that one. So, yeah, we don't need government at all, and I would highly recommend that these guys move to Somalia. There is no stable government there. It's wonderful. There's no taxes. There's no government organizations. Anyone who wants no government, go to Somalia. You'll have a great time. You'll probably never make it out. It's okay. You got what you wanted. So all I'm saying is no government is actually bad. And if we think about who do we trust to do what's in the interest of the people, none of us totally trust government. I get that, and we probably shouldn't. But who do you trust more? Is government, or do you trust private enterprise? Again, child labor laws, slavery. We know the history of what private enterprise does, and they do exactly what they're supposed to do, which is do what makes them the most profitable. They are not meant to be ethical. Government's sole job is to keep people's interests in mind. Government's sole job is to make a more level playing field. Now, they're not very good at it. There's a lot of progress to be made. But who do you want to be deciding whether or not things are censored? Do you want a private enterprise who can profit off the censorship? Or do you want a government saying no one can censor everything, anything, everyone's allowed to say what they want? And by the way, no one on the internet has ever called me at 5 o'clock in the morning when I didn't want them to. When you don't want the internet, you turn it off. It's a very different situation than what the opponents are saying. We all know the internet and how it works. It's an opt-in situation. So you opt into the internet, whatever you want to do on the internet, you're opting in. So the point is, should private enterprise be regulating what you do or do not see? And when it comes down to what, individual freedoms, the way to get individual freedoms is to have a free and open internet where there's no censorship.
So I'll respond to a point that he started off by making. It's worth noting that Somalia became the country that it is now because it was a failed socialist state, which is a top-down government-controlled system. Moving on to the other point that you raised about slavery, slavery actually was a regulation. In 1664, there was actually what were referred to as the slave code, which meant that any slave that was that moved from one state to another or moved off the plantation was any person who ran into that state was compelled, not by private enterprise, but by government, to act accordingly, which meant returning them to their master. That was not private enterprise. That was a force of government. That like as it pertains to your assertions about ISP censorship, I'll go back and reiterate what I said in my introduction. All the cases of supposed ISP throttling have not been out of malice. No ISP has blocked access to the internet just on a whim or because they sought to profit from it. Verizon did not block Google's wallet because of malice. That was a technical issue that ran between Verizon and Google, and they both came to an understanding on it. One, to block it because that pertained to a particular element on the like a hardware element on the phone, and even without government regulation, they came to an understanding. So, like, I'll reiterate what I said earlier, that there is no factual case for net neutrality. These fears that ISPs are going to censor your content, they're unfounded because ISPs know what they make money on, and that's your content.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Before we finish up this segment, I just want to ask a pointed question to each group. So let me start off a question to Team 1. So a lot of times when we had this debate on net neutrality, people talk about public utility and also the role of government in certain services. So the question to Team 1 is, if government is so efficient and fair at operating services, would something like USPS be a good example as opposed to another private carrier, say FedEx or UPS?
I can take this. So it's not our assertion that government is perfect. And it's also not our assertion that government should build and run these networks. However, I think the FCC would be a better analogy than the USPS. It provides a limited, necessary oversight function so the system can work as intended.
I just want to say a place that I'll actually agree with my opponents is in small government. I'm actually a very small government person. I believe in small government, but the government should have a big stick. It should be able to regulate. And that's the government's job, is to regulate, to make a more free and open marketplace. And unfortunately, this net neutrality is getting rid of a free and open marketplace that's creating censorship. As opposed to the, my opponent was saying, no one has ever violated the rule. Well, I've never killed anyone. It's still illegal for me to kill someone. So just because the ISPs have not violated the net neutrality rules, which were just now overturned, doesn't mean they never will. And there's no reason to legalize letting them overturn it if they're never going to do it. So then just keep net neutrality in place if they're never going to violate them.
And finally, question for Team 2 is, in the era of media consolidation, and you see a lot of these big conglomerates, isn't it almost inevitable that you're going to have a big company such as Comcast or Time Warner, and one day you might have a scenario where they say that, you know what, we don't like certain websites because the ideological views that are espoused on these websites just simply don't meet with their corporate views. So can't they simply just weighing out that website and make it inaccessible? And how would you address that issue?
So the question pertains to the consolidation of media companies, and I guess the wider premise here, the wider principle is consolidation of big business a problem? This is something raised by Marx in the early 19th century, and it still hasn't come true to this day without government assistance. The free market doesn't create monopolies and never has in history. Every single monopoly we have examples of on the books was created by an act of government, and with government assistance the entire time. In the case of media consolidation, today's world, if you left it open to the free markets, as my partner had said earlier, these companies fully understand that there are two sources of their business. There's the person they're pulling the content from and the person they're delivering the content to. If you alienate either side in that arrangement, you lose business and you no longer exist as a corporate concern. Corporations, contrary to many people in the media and in politics today, and I'm afraid to say in the city all over the place, companies don't benefit by screwing over their customers. Companies don't benefit by offering their customers poisonous food or rotten service. Companies thrive in the market by offering a value that people want to buy. There's a difference there between what the government wields, which is political power, and what a company wields, which is economic power, the ability to produce and offer a value. If I build a better mousetrap than you, I don't harm you physically by doing it. I'm wielding economic power in that circumstance. If you hit me with a club in my head and take my mousetrap, you're wielding political power over me, and that's illegitimate. So that's the essential difference, is there's a big equivocation here on the use of the word power.
Okay, thanks. All right, we're going to move on to the final segment, which is the Q&A from audience. So if you want to ask a question, we ask you to come up, and we could take turns asking questions. So the first question will be to Team 1. So if you want to ask a question, please come up. First come, first serve, you got to come up. But we could only ask one question at a time to each team so that we could keep it fair. So if you could just tell us your name, and you're going to ask a question to Team 1, yes? Yes. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
All right, my name is Jacob Desser, and I'm here to ask particularly that my belief on net neutrality is not that goes beyond based on reports, some recent reports that, as you see, Apple has announced to slow down all the devices in order to convince customers to buy their latest product. So that doesn't particularly play on internet. It plays in other industries like Apple. So if the government should get out and regulate Apple from doing that.
So I first just want to say I have an old iPhone, and I share your concern. I'm really furious about it, that they degrade the service. It's a slightly different issue, but it illustrates the risk that if large companies are able to downgrade service to a certain class of customer in order to maximize profits, they will do it in a heartbeat. And so I think even though it's a type of hardware, it illustrates exactly where the future is headed potentially for the internet if we do not institute net neutrality. So thank you.
I just want to make a point to point out something that my opponent said. If ISPs, you'll notice this word come around every now and again. If, well, that hasn't happened before without these rules in place. As Garrett said, oh, well, if it hasn't happened, well, then just put the rules in place. No, because then these rules will get in the way of ISPs managing their networks in a way that is efficient not only to them, but to their customers. So in the case with Comcast and BitTorrent is a bandwidth-intensive application that if left to its processes, would have throttled the internet service or congested the network for other people on the network who weren't using it. So if I recall correctly, I think it was somewhere between 5 and 10% of BitTorrent's of Comcast customers were using BitTorrent. So now to favor a policy like net neutrality, you'd be arguing in favor allowing this small percentage of the customer base to ruin the quality of service for everyone else.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Well, you could say that for closing statement? We got to save it, yeah. All right, next question will be Team 2. And Gene, you want to ask a question? Come up. And we ask you, in the interest of time, just get right to the question, no rhetorical statements. 1996?
So the U.S. government and by extension American public, why should they tolerate the corporate actions and the views that goes against the freedom they enjoy and guaranteed by United States? They operate here, so you lose business. What of it?
So the question was, why should the American public tolerate the activities of corporations? I'm going to point out sort of I reject the premise of the question. There is no public per se. Public is a metaphor. It refers to all of us. It refers to everybody in this room, everybody in the city, everybody in the country. And that includes people who work for and built the ISPs themselves. These are all just metaphors when we talk about one group versus another group. At the end of the day, all that exists are individuals. That's who we are. We're concrete human beings. We basically invest our time, our effort, our brain power to create and trade with other people. And we do so on terms that are mutually beneficial. The one rule that is legitimate for government to enforce is that you cannot use force against somebody else to get your way. So the only thing the quote-unquote public should not tolerate is the use of physical force where it doesn't belong. And that is in the voluntary trades and transactions that happen with all of us. If it's efficient economically for people to organize in a company and then say, we're going to sell services under this name, then that's what we have in the market. But there's no violation of rights that occur, and there's no room for the public or anyone who presumes to speak on its behalf, which is what you usually get when someone starts talking about the public, to impose their will on somebody else with the use of a gun, which is what government action always is, implicitly.
Any other questions from the audience? For Team 1, yes, come on up. If you could just state your name and ask the question.
Thank you. My name is Evan. My question is, it seems to me that Netflix imposes a cost on Verizon. By the virtue of net neutrality, Verizon has to accept Netflix's traffic onto their network. If Verizon cannot charge Netflix, right, for imposing that cost on them, the net result is that me, the ISP customer, is essentially paying for the cost that Netflix is imposing on Verizon. So my question, is it fair that I have to pay a cost that Netflix imposes on a third party?
So I tried to make this clear early on, and I apologize if I didn't make it clear enough. Net neutrality has nothing to do with charging large internet companies for bandwidth. That's always happened. I bought internet service, between 2001 and 2009 many, many times. Whenever I wanted more bandwidth, I was paying more money, I'll guarantee you that. I was buying it for Fortune 50 companies, so we were big companies, similar to Netflix. But we always paid for more bandwidth. That's always been the case. It always will be the case. You're paying for more product or service. The question about net neutrality is, can people audit what is passed on those internet lines and tell you, an ISP say what can or cannot pass on those internet lines? You've always paid for more bandwidth. We always will. So the whole idea that Netflix doesn't pay for its bandwidth is a completely false argument.
Well, to, I guess, fact check, if you will, something that my opponent just raised, during the dispute between Comcast and Netflix went to a third party to essentially, I guess you could say, get some pay prioritization, to get its data cached in a way that would make it faster to deliver to its customers. All right, so there are some complex issues that I'm going to raise, and I'll try to be as quick and salient as I can. So first off, I want to make it clear that a capitalistic system is not one wherein all entities are naturally combative to each other. In fact, as I think one of them, I believe it was Fred, raised, that there's a symbiotic relationship if the web's neutral. Well, a symbiotic relationship exists in absence of government because, frankly, without government regulation, big ISPs come together in what's known as peering relationships, where they exchange traffic between each other because it's in both of their best interests. So, if you will, think of a situation where a package delivery company services one area and a different package delivery company services another. So they come together to service customers in each of their areas in what's known as peering. Now, what happened in the Comcast-Netflix dispute was that Netflix came to an ISP called Cogent and Level 3, and they wanted to enter a peering agreement with Comcast. Now, they already had a peering agreement, which was kind of lopsided because Cogent's traffic was 2 to 1. with the inclusion of Netflix, that would have raised the ratio to 5-to-1, which would have completely congested, and it did congest Comcast's network. So as he said, well, it's not about paying more. Well, net neutrality isn't about paying more for more bandwidth. Well, if you look at the supposed violation, Netflix was trying to get away with not paying more for more bandwidth.
Thanks, Louis. We have time for 2 more questions. So next question will be to Team 1. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, Team 2. Sorry, I skipped one. Good.
We'll take it. So the internet is a very dynamic entity that's evolved over time. So the internet, as it was structured 20 years ago, it doesn't look like it's structured today. 10 years ago, it wasn't structured as it today. We've developed, AJAX, all sorts of different ways of getting information around the wires and developing the network. How do you feel that net neutrality would affect the dynamic evolution of the internet?
You can go.
Well, I think that it's pretty clear that any person who's making the argument in favor of net neutrality knows that a blanket ban on blocking and throttling is impractical, because in the networking world, there's something known as quality of service. There's always, I'll make this clear, there is always prioritization when it comes to data going on behind the scenes. I think Fred said, well, the net is a neutral place where you don't discriminate between email and video. That's actually factually incorrect. Video is always prioritized over email, because if you get your email a few minutes late, or those data packets reach you late, then there's no big deal. There's no disruption in quality of service. But if your video packets arrive a bit late, then you see that circling sign and you have a bad time. So to answer Julian's question, I think that government regulation, innovation happens despite government regulation, not because of it. If you look at the Comcast Netflix situation, both of those, they came together and they actually came to an agreement that benefits both Comcast, Netflix, and the end user, because Netflix created an algorithm that compressed its video and allowed it to stream its content for users who had a lower, a lower internet speed or effectivity or efficiency. And Comcast was benefited because, frankly, the acceptance of Netflix on its servers allowed it to deliver a better quality of service to its end users, and its end users benefited obviously because they didn't have to look at that god-awful buffering sign. Like net neutrality. In closing, net neutrality is a way to hobble the internet. It's not a way to preserve it as it was.
Thanks, Louis. Okay, one more question for Team 1. Anyone from the audience? Yes, sir. Come on up. If you could state your name and just a quick question.
Hi, my name is Rahul. That was some very well-meant arguments towards net neutrality, but one of the points I do want to mention is in your opening statement, you compared and drew a parallels between net neutrality and internet being somewhat akin to utilities, especially towards the telephone line. From what I know right now, even my phone, I cannot make international calls, although it is part of the network. So when you think about it, even current utilities actually do have a bias towards some services, whereas others do not. So that's kind of more towards the argument of not being net neutral, because it's a utility, which again, and my second part, which I think the opposition forgot to mention, is zero rating, which is very important in the case of net neutrality debate. And for those of you who do not know about this, zero rating is about a concept where someone like Google or Facebook could bring internet to about 50 million people in the United States who do not have internet currently, and about 3 billion people around the world who do not have internet currently as well. And if we were to pass regulations which confirm to net neutral internet, we could never have zero-rated websites, and we could never have at least a glimpse of the internet to all these people around the world who have never seen the internet. How are you going to deal with this? So this is a two-part question. Thank you.
Okay, so for the first question, I'm a little confused, so I might ask you to clarify, but you're saying a phone has local service and international service, and therefore it's different than the internet. But the idea is that a phone, you pay for the usage of your phone. Now you could have a high bandwidth internet or low bandwidth internet, or you could have local service or international service. It's just different levels of the service that you're buying. It just happens to be that internet is international by default, just based on the way it was constructed, whereas cell phone companies were constructed locally. So that's just an inherent difference in the way that the infrastructure and architecture were created and the historical buying and selling patterns of each. But the fact is they're both utilities. They're both ubiquitous in day-to-day life. And at the end of the day, you don't expect someone to be eavesdropping on every telephone call. And if I say that I'm going to switch away from Verizon, you don't expect your phone call to cut off. And what net neutrality's overturn does is allows ISPs to essentially cut off your internet if you say something that they don't like. And our opponents are saying, well, ISPs have never done that. And that they're never going to do it. Well, if they're never going to do it, just leave the net neutrality laws in place, right? Like, we're all happy.
So I'll field the second question about zero rating. So obviously, if governments want to give their service away for the larger good, that's a separate question. The problem is if you have the ability to price differently for different types of people, then that opens a huge Pandora's box that can lead to some very dark places.
And we will move on to the final segment, which are closing statements beginning with Team 2. And each side will have 3 minutes to tell the case to the members of the jury.
Can I get a minute back since I was a minute ahead on the front?
Sorry, no refunds, no credit.
No recycling? All right. We had a debate about whether we got more time in the beginning or the end. I wanted more time at the end.
And we'll start with Team 2. Again, the topic is government should regulate
Wait, are we doing
neutrality.
timing it again, or you got it? Okay. So I'll wait for the clock to start. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to do a quick hit and run here of just some of the things that I think were mentioned and were not addressed. Real quick, child labor was mentioned earlier as something that private industry was making money off of. Did anyone ever ask what the children were doing before they were in the factories? If you want to know, go to Bangladesh today, where they're doing very much what they did back then, which is work on the farms in backbreaking labor, trying to make sure their families didn't starve. So you have to be contextual when you look at the factory system and when children were working. It was a very poor society. And until it rose up to where it is today, child labor had to happen. Otherwise, people would have starved. Openness was mentioned a lot in the opening speech of one of my opponents. And I want to say that I think this idea of openness is a fuzzy concept. What really matters ultimately are two things, property rights and coercion. The only openness that matters in my view is the openness to enter this market and make it competitive and offer a value for people who are willing to pay for it. That's the only concrete idea of openness that I think matters here. I love this term, by the way, fact check. It sounds like, we need a doctor in the house to resuscitate a patient. We need someone to fact check the fact, I think everything that's been said here has been factual, but I think that on the issue of Somalia, I think my partner had mentioned that that's a failed state, not a limited state. Our opponents tried to straw man us earlier when we were saying that there should be no FCC, there should be no ICC. We're not saying there should be no government. We're not anarchists. I'm not an anarchist. I advocate for a limited government with very strict limited powers that protect individual citizens from coercion, not regulating their ideas and not regulating what they can and can't buy with their money. He also missed the point about my bedroom call example, or coming into my bedroom to sing the 12 Days of Christmas. I wasn't saying that you couldn't shut the internet off. It had nothing to do with that. The idea is that all rights are contextual. Rights are contextual based on the property rights of people involved. You can't come sing 12 Days of Christmas in my bedroom at night, not because I can't turn you off, but because it's my bedroom, it's my property. It's contextual. Your free speech is limited by my property rights in that instance. So that doesn't make much sense to me. And the last thing I'll close with is actually not so much something they said, but just a quick analogy that I think makes this very concrete. I see a real similarity between the railroad industry and the internet. And the reason I see this is because both are the circulatory system for their respective economies. The railroads were the circulatory system for the early 20th century and the late 19th century in America, and the internet is the circulatory system of today's global market. And In the case of the railroads, they were accused of all manner of anti-competitive behavior and nearly regulated out of existence. The little you see that's left of them is Amtrak. Look at all the derailments. Look at the state of the subway today where you're packed into a car like a bunch of cattle. It's degraded, and if you subject the internet to the same kind of regulations as you did the railroads, it'll go the same way. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And we'll move on. Closing statements, 3 minutes for Team 1 with Fred.
Thanks. So first I'd like to return to some of the pillars of the negatives arguments. First, they bring up the point that it's expensive and it's difficult to provide internet service. That's true, and they're handsomely compensated for it. That does not, however, give you the right to circumvent free speech, intrude in people's private internet conversations, or discriminate by user, content, or website. The other side has asserted that just because the incidents that have happened by large companies throttling content have not been taken place out of malice, that therefore the government shouldn't prevent such future activities. What's new is that they've proved that it can be done. And the intent thus far may or may not have been through malice, but they've opened a door, and that is something we need to respond to. They've mentioned the proper role of regulation. We've discussed that. And of course, they have reiterated many times that their position stems from their belief that they reject the premise of any government body overseeing corporate enterprises. That's a separate discussion. But what we have and what we know is that the internet exists within the context of government regulation. It's grown up within it, and it currently exists within it. So that legitimacy has been established. Finally, they've maintained that companies only act in the benefit of their consumers. And for that, I would offer the counterexample of airlines. I'd like to return to our points. The essential qualities of the internet are freedom and fairness and opportunity. The term of the debate is net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers must treat all data on the internet the same and not discriminate or charge differently by user, content, website, platform, application, type of attached equipment, or method of communication. To preserve the internet that we know and that has given such benefit to mankind, we need net neutrality. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brett. And last but not least, on Team 2, we have Louis.
So, as I said earlier, innovation occurs despite government regulation, not because of it. Government regulation is a list of things you can't do, not things that are there to benefit you. In the case of, as this gentleman pointed out, zero rating. Zero rating is actually a policy that would benefit end users. It's the exemption of streaming video from your data limits. Who doesn't want free data? And that's a violation of net neutrality. See, this kind of goes against a point that I believe Garrett said. Well, it's not about, I believe Garrett said something along the lines of, well, this isn't about not paying more for more bandwidth, or well, if ISPs didn't do this, then why not just let these rules stay in place? That's because these rules apply to things that actually benefit the end user, and these regulations would stop ISPs from doing so, as is the case with Comcast. If they were completely banned from throttling BitTorrent traffic, the quality of service for the other users would have been completely degraded. Why is that? Why is it exactly? Should we regulate the internet based on these tall tales that haven't even occurred as they've been illustrated? The rules that were put in place in 2015 are actually so old that in the text they reference telegraph technology. I'm not joking here. They actually in the text reference telegraphs. This is how this is like dusting off a book about dodos and treating it like, oh, so this is a book about farming chickens in 2017. It's absurd. It's absurd. It just doesn't seem like it's a rational way to go about things, to put limitations on a space as dynamic as the internet based on regulations that were drafted during the Depression. My opponents might make the case that, well, net neutrality has been around since 2005. No, they've existed since 2005 as a vague policy that wasn't actually law, and ISPs actually knew that, which is why they consistently took the FCC to court. This, I think, I'll just reiterate exactly what I said in my opening statement. The facts just simply do not support the need for net neutrality. There haven't been any violations of it, and the laws only serve to hobble services and drastically low, and sorry, not drastically lower, and prevent drastically lower prices for end users.
Thanks, Louis. Garrett.
Thanks. So I'm not following his argument there in that he's saying that it's drastically, like as far as the economic viability, ISPs have been economically viable without violating all these laws. So first he's saying no one has violated net neutrality, and then he's saying the only way it can be economically viable is if you violate net neutrality. Doesn't make sense. So, I'm not following it, but let me also say that they have said a lot of doublespeak tonight. One of which is that a symbiotic relationships does not exist with government presence. That doesn't make sense. Governments do a lot of good things. They build roads, they put out fires, they keep us safe from criminals. There's lots of good things that government does. Government's good at regulating insurance to make sure that we all are able to get our insurance benefits from insurance companies. I had an insurance company not pay me, and until I went to the Department of Insurance, they didn't pay me. And then once I did, they did. So government is good at being small government that regulates in a heavy way. Second of all, comparing prioritization of packets coming a few seconds later versus packets never coming at all is not a fair comparison. We're talking about ISPs censoring people. That's what net neutrality does, is it says ISPs can censor. These guys have been talking all night about individual liberties. If we want individual liberties, we should be able to access any website we want on the internet. We should be able to say anything we want on the internet. All net neutrality's overturn does is get rid of those rights, those individual freedoms that we have had and that we've come to love. It's getting rid of those individual freedoms in favor of allowing ISPs to favor whoever they choose to favor for whatever reason they choose to favor it. And if you all think ISPs are completely altruistic and looking out for your best interests, by all means, go ahead and don't believe in net neutrality. But I think most of us know that companies are trying to make money, and they will do what they can to make money, whether it's ethical or not. As far as child labor, the claim that child labor had to happen or people would starve, I'm sorry, but child labor laws were passed, and there was not mass starvation in this country. So that's blatantly false. Child labor did not have to happen. It was a travesty. Thank God that we have child labor laws now. But to say that evil things are going to happen whether we regulate them or not, and if we regulate them, everything's going to get worse, it's just been proven not to be true in history. We make our laws better over time. That's part of why we have amendments. That's part of why we have a legal system that evolves. Our laws should get better, and our marketplace should become fairer, and individual freedoms that these guys are talking about should become more clear. The way to have individual freedoms is to have a free and open internet, not to have ISPs regulating what you can and can't say. Next, the opposition advocates for limited government that doesn't regulate what people can or can't do. Interestingly, they're arguing that ISPs should be allowed to say what people can and can't do. So should we go from having government say, let people do whatever they want on the internet, to ISPs can say what they can or can't do? I don't think that's a fair trade.
Okay, thanks, Garrett. And that will conclude. And that will conclude the net neutrality debate. Now we're going to ask you to take the second poll. Just go to the second link at the bottom. And if you could just do the final tally. And just remember that the team with significant difference in upward vote is the prevailing team. So if you could take a moment to do that. In the meantime, do you guys want to say a word or two about the app while we're waiting?
Sure. Thanks again for allowing Michael to sponsor the event. I encourage everyone to download the app. It's iOS, so if you have an iPhone, you can create a debate. You can also go to the website, mikegoat.com. That's Mike, as in Mike, greatest of all time.com, and you can watch the debates there as well. And we hope you engage with our community. There are a few thousand of us now since we formally launched last week, so please check it out. Thanks very much.
All right, folks, we have the results. We took a ballot before and after the debate. And again, the difference is the team that has most swayed opinions wins. So team 1, again, they're in favor of government intervention in net neutrality. They started out with 9 votes. And after the debate, their tally went up to 11 votes. So that's an increase of 22%. Team 2, in favor of a more market approach, started out with 4 votes and went up to 9 votes. And that's an increase of 125%. And then the undecided votes were 7 before the debate and went down to 2, which is a negative 71%. So although Team 1 had more votes, it's the net differential that goes to Team 2. And Team 2 is the victor for tonight's debate. Thanks.